Midwives Book went into print in 1671, which actually was quite an eventful time in history, particularly in the history of London, where it was published. On the 9th of May that same year, Thomas Blood and his accomplices overpowered the master of the jewel house in the Tower of London, and they made away with the crown jewels. Not only did he get away with it, King Charles II was so amazed at his audacity that he rewarded Thomas Blood with some land and quite a considerable pension of some kind. 2 years earlier, in 1669, Samuel Pepys wrote in his diary for the last time. He explained that it was straining his eyes to keep writing in the dim light. And he was only a young man, only in his 30s. And at the same time, Sir Christopher Wren was officially given permission to design the new St Paul's Cathedral. The rebuilding of London after the Great Fire of 1666 was just getting underway. But as for basic human biology, well, that hasn't changed so much. As Jane Sharp would tell you herself. On page 32, she remarks that some girls are more forward at 12 years than some at 16 years of age. And we would probably say the same today. Everybody develops at different times, and some 12-year-olds today are indeed more developed than some 16 and 17-year-olds. It's just the way individual biology works. Page 69. Jane notes that typically girls started their periods around the age of 14. She observes that poor health could delay them until they were 18 or sometimes 20. And indeed today we would probably seek medical advice if we got to the age of 18 as a female with no signs of any period starting too. That hasn't changed. Periods she views as purgations, the body getting rid of something it doesn't need. And again, when you compare it to our modern understanding, that is really quite accurate. On page 72, a comment that any modern parent will relate to: children are often feeding when they want both growth and nourishment. I was certainly asked the question, have you got hollow leg, when I was much younger, when I was growing? And I'm sure some of you have heard that phrase too. Growth spurts and big appetites frequently do go together. Page 82, she remarks that the signs of pregnancy can include nausea, sickness and craving for strange things, in some cases non-food items. We know this to be a particular condition now called pica. And then something really interesting on page 103. It astonished me to find that actually Jane Sharp understood the concept that unborn babies receive nourishment from their mother via the umbilical cord. The way she talks about it is like it's general knowledge. Now, how on earth did they understand that then? I cannot tell you, but they did. Of course, as a midwife, she must have encountered expectant mothers feeling their unborn babies move. It's totally logical that she puts this movement down to a belief that the baby swims in these waters like as in a bath. She thinks it's swimming in there. Now, following childbirth, women generally had a lying-in period in which they could recover, and in this time somebody usually took over the household chores, and naturally sex was completely off limits. And this usually continues until the woman was churched or attended a Thanksgiving service in a local church for getting through the birth safely. Jane, as I mentioned before, did recommend 30 days confinement for a boy and 40 days if you had a daughter. The confinement is giving them a bit of time to step back from their usual duties. So is it the beginning of what we call maternity leave, perhaps? But there's one other really interesting point that almost foretells scientific advances here. On page 164, there's an absolutely remarkable theory put forward. Jane believes that when the baby is born, before you cut the umbilical cord, you should endeavour to push back some of the blood into the baby, because it would strengthen it, and then of course you tie it and cut it as normal. These days, some hospitals do offer the option to bank cord blood on the understanding that the stem cells might be useful to treat various medical conditions, blood disorders and anything else that may come up for both for the child and other people in the future. Maybe Jane Sharp was onto something there. Maybe. Now, human beings haven't changed very much in 350 years, but our understanding of science and biology certainly has. When you read the Midwives Book, you do notice that some of Jane Sharp's theories about the human body do seem a little bit strange to us as a modern audience. On page 73, she puts forward the theory that the liver converts digested food into blood. In 1628, the English doctor William Harvey published a work which translates into English as an anatomical exercise on the motion of the heart and blood in living beings. Today, we accept his theory that the heart is the chief pump, if you like, of the circulatory system. That is, the heart is solely responsible for moving the blood around the arteries and it is received back through the veins, back to the heart. We understand that to be correct. When William Harvey published that theory, it was groundbreaking. The accepted knowledge came from Galen, who Jane Sharp really seems to like. He was a 2nd century Roman doctor, I have mentioned in the previous video, and he was the first person to realise that arterial blood was different to venous blood. There is more oxygen in arterial blood and less in the venous blood. And he also thought that the venous blood was created by the liver and then sent out to the other organs. Today we understand that differently, but we do understand that the liver does filter the blood and it can also expand to act as a kind of reservoir for any extra blood that the body produces and stores essential vitamins and minerals like iron. So although his theory might not have been quite as we understand biology today, you can see how Galen might have developed that theory. What did you do in 1671 if you thought you were pregnant? You did not, of course, go down to your nearest chemist for a pregnancy test. Any of you who have used a pregnancy test are familiar with how you use it. Where we would use the pregnancy test like that today, Jane simply advises using a needle instead. If the needle develops red spots, then you're pregnant. Or alternatively, red spots might just mean the needle has gone rusty because you got it wet. Just a guess. Jane in 1671 believes that the mother's imagination when she was pregnant will affect the appearance of her child. If a baby was born with a red birthmark, then Jane and her contemporaries might put this down to the fact that the mother craved a red food like strawberries or beetroot during pregnancy. When a baby is in a more unusual position, either the feet or the head or the bottom are not presenting first, some other part is trying to come out first, Jane Sharp suggests that the midwife should push the baby back up inside into the mother, no anaesthetic of course, and somehow turn the baby so that either the head or the feet or the bottom are coming out first. Surely by that stage, if it is a feet coming and it's safe enough to do it, isn't it just easier to let them be born? And apart from which, if the midwife is reaching in to turn them with her hands, that suggests that if delivery is imminent, surely the waters are broken too. I think Jane Sharp is seriously overestimating how much space there is around a full-time baby when it is just about to be born. After a difficult labour, it was considered beneficial to wrap a newly flayed sheepskin around the mother's back. If she just means the fleece, sort of woolly blanket, I see the logic, that would be comforting, it would offer warmth. However, if she just literally does mean the skin taken straight off the sheep, I'd like to pass on that one, thank you very much. Right at the end of the Midwives Book, there is also just a brief section on treating minor medical conditions in babies, amongst which she suggests a cure for what she calls hiccups, which we call hiccups. So how is she going to cure these hiccups? Well, what you need is a feather. You want to put it in the mouth of the child and you want to tickle the back of the throat in order to make the child vomit. No. Strange cures for hiccups aside, what do I think of Jane Sharp? If she was around today, I think she would relate to what they call the active birth philosophy. They suggest that the mother should be able to move around during labour as much as she wants, deliver the baby in whatever position is comfortable, whether that is standing up, kneeling, on a chair, in a birthing pool, whatever suits. In some parts of the world, I think that would be considered radical and probably completely unacceptable. I think in some parts of the world there is quite a traditional approach to how labour and childbirth is managed, and a more flexible approach in other countries. And that's not to say that one is right and one is wrong, it's just differences in attitudes to childbirth. There are, of course, many different healthcare systems, all have their own views on childbirth, so we can't expect everybody to look on these things the same way. I'm sure that even back in her day, Jane Sharp probably knew midwives who agreed with her philosophies and who she would trust to act as a backup if she couldn't attend a labour. And there were probably quite a few people around that she knew that she just didn't agree with their method of looking after a woman in labour. In the cases where intervention, such as it was needed, definitely she would be one of those people who would think it was really important to get the mother's consent before she actually did anything. Again, it's a big issue I think that people do have even today, is that they don't feel that, and not just in childbirth, in lots of situations, people don't always feel like they're given the full information, and of course if it's an emergency you don't have much time to take things in, you can't process things properly. But I think Jane would want to reassure her patient and to make sure that the patient understood the intervention before proceeding. She strikes me as that kind of midwife. Most importantly, I think that she valued both the practical and the theoretical sides of midwifery training. I think she understood that hands-on experience had its place, and so did theoretical, what you might call book learning. There are two sides to a subject like this, because you've got to understand why you're doing what you're doing if you need to do it. To her, midwifery is absolutely not just a way to make money. It's a vocation, it's something that requires very specialist skills, it is to be valued, it's something you should do because you genuinely want to assist labouring women. And actually, the basic principle of that is something that today's medical professionals would agree with. As a social historian, however, I am fascinated by her advice on how medical problems are treated and the way illnesses were understood. It tells you a bit about how people were educated about these things. It also gives you all those little tiny incidental hints about the things that people might have eaten and drunk and grown in their garden, even if they do sound a bit strange or weird. Some of her approaches and practices I think still have some merit. Others haven't stood the test of time at all, and that is just part of how we make progress as a society if we're constantly learning things. What really astonishes me about the Midwives Book is just the idea that in the 1670s there is a midwife practising in England who was astute enough to collate her knowledge into a lengthy book, which I'm almost certain she wrote herself. She commissioned illustrations to go with it, and she actually got it published for other people to buy and read and learn from. And all that is happening at around the same time that the female dramatist Aphra Behn was having her first play performed. John Dryden was the first poet laureate. Sir Christopher Wren was busy designing all those new buildings, including the 54 churches to replace those lost in the Great Fire of London. She was alive at a point in time where all these really famous people were doing amazing things. So whoever Jane Sharp really was, just the thought of her living in that time is absolutely amazing. And the fact that she wrote her book and got it published in that sort of time is absolutely amazing too. I think so. Maybe you think so too. So that brings me to the end of my series on the Midwives Book. In the process, I have actually ended up thinking I might end up making a talk out of this, and maybe one day I will. But what I would really like to know, because I have got all sorts of plans for future videos, is there anything in particular that you would like me to talk about? Please leave me a comment and suggest some ideas. I would love to have a new project to work on. Who knows where it will go. Thanks for listening.